Second to load up. Always takes a little bit more than a second, or at least a second that you'd think it would take. Looks like it is up and loaded. Always takes a little bit more than a second. There's my echo. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, just to keep me on my toes. Wouldn't want this to get boring after all. Turd. There we go. And now we can share the screen. Oh, I think I shared the wrong screen. Shared the PDFs rather than sharing the actual text. There we go. That's the one we want. Hopefully that will catch up on the feed. Yep, there we go. Okay, so we'll give it just our usual little second for everyone to log in. Make sure that I've got the Zoom controls handy, and then we'll get down to work. Hope that everybody is doing well and is keeping up with their Torah reading. As a reminder to anybody that might be new to studying with me, that's either joining through Zoom or YouTube, or perhaps is logging in some future point, and that's why we keep it up on YouTube. We don't study the entire parasha together because it would be impossible to do it justice within an hour. Instead, we take slices. So please go back through the back catalog, as well as avail yourself of other resources, such as Safaria, which we use extensively, as well as all the other great resources out there to study the rest of the parasha. At the very least, make sure that you are reading through the remainder of the text, both before and after any piece we study, so that you can at least fill in the rest of the context, and ideally have at least one or two of the other commentaries with you to help guide you in that process. All right, so that's a good disclaimer to go ahead and begin. I don't think I'd said that publicly for a while, so it always feels good to remind people of that. So we are in Vayishlach, and of course, Vayishlach is dominated by the story of Jacob's reunification. Reunion is better with his brother Esau, because they don't reunify, but they definitely have a meetup. And that is amazing. We've studied it before, and there's still more to say about it, but today we're going to look at a different section. We're going to look at the birth of Benjamin. This is the final son of the 12. And we are going to look at, in the process, the passing of Rachel, his mother. So I just realized I hadn't put my phone on Do Not Disturb. Let me take care of that. Otherwise, it's guaranteed to disturb us. So Rachel, as everybody is remember from last week's Torah portion, was the person that most captivated Yaakov, that he worked for her for that initial 7 years, and then an additional 7 years after the deception with the wedding of Leah. So this is a very poignant and powerful moment, and one that, well, as we'll see, has a lot to teach us in many different aspects of life. So let's go ahead and get to the Torah itself. It is a short section, but like I said, one that is rich. They moved on from Beit El, but when there was still a stretch of land to come to Ephrat, meaning they weren't there yet, Rachel began to give birth, and she had a very hard birthing. So birth in the ancient world, just like the modern world, was exceedingly difficult, but the modern world has numerous resources to help make that an easier process and a more survivable process. Unfortunately, in the ancient world, those resources were not there. So the fact that we are reading a verse that says that it was a very difficult delivery would be sending off alarm bells to any ancient listener and really any pre-modern listener, because there is a strong indication of what's coming. It was when her birthing was at its hardest that the midwife said to her, "Do not be afraid, for this one too is a son for you." All right, so we're going to lay out the question that's going to dominate our commentaries and see where it takes us when we get there, which is, how is this helpful? when my own children were being born, when there were difficulties, um, reminding my wife of the gender of the child was not likely to be something that would make the pains and difficulty of the birth somehow more bearable. Uh, Not to say that we, did or didn't have a particular preference for the child, whatever your own personal feelings may be on that. But in the moment of this difficulty, it does seem an odd form of consolation, telling her that it's almost done, telling her that she'll get through it, telling her that she's doing great, standard encouraging words, telling her it's a boy when the birth isn't actually complete or such, because as we see here, it is in the midst of the birthing that this is taking place. Then it's unclear on the surface of it what consolation this is meant to be. Now, as I've said 100 times, probably more than that at this point in my career, it's okay and indeed desirable to be at a point in reading the text where you scratch your head to say, what does that mean? To say that doesn't sound like it would be helpful, to say that doesn't seem like a useful thing. That is not criticizing the text, and it's certainly not criticizing the author, capital A. It is instead recognizing that the text wants us to engage more than at a surface level. It wants us to scratch our head and say, that's an interesting phrase. Let me think about that, and even better, let me talk to others or listen to others as we go through the commentary across time, and see what else has been said about that. And of course, we are going to duck back into this verse in great detail, but we need to continue the story before we can do that. It was as her life was slipping away, for she was dying, that she called his name Ben-Oni, or son of my woe. That's what Ben-Oni would be literally translated as. But his father, that's Jacob, called him Binyamin, son of the right hand. So we can see how Binyamin and Ben-Oni have a very similar assonance to them. They are similarly flavored. We can also perhaps understand why Jacob would be reluctant to name his youngest son the son of woe. While it is certainly true that he will be grieving for the death of Rachel, naming the child as a constant reminder of that pain is already not a great idea. And naming the child in a way that the child will grow with that albatross around his neck of being the son of the mother's woe would be even more damaging for that child. So we can understand why Jacob would alter the name that Rachel had chosen. It's not inappropriate to change a deathbed wish if the deathbed wish is going to mean persistent harm and damage completely unnecessarily to the living. So he fixes it, names the child Benjamin, and of course Benjamin is going to figure prominently in the cycle of stories involving Joseph in just a little while. Onward though. So Rachel died. She was buried along the way to Ephrat, that is, Bethlehem. Yaakov set up a standing pillar over her burial place. That is Rachel's burial pillar today. All right, so we are, first of all, just reminded of the custom of having a fixed place for burial that is marked, having a matzeva, a monument, a pillar, as he's describing it in the translation here, or a headstone in the modern world's usage of the term. This is, as you can see, an extremely old part of Jewish practice. But we also have to stop and say, I wonder why the Torah is bothering to tell me this. I mean, people do die, and we don't often get much description of their death, let alone their burial. True, we did for Sarah and for Avraham with the issue of the cave of Machpelah, but why are we mentioning this here? First of all, of course, we're going to mention it here because it is not Machpelah. It is not in Hebron. It is not in the place where both Abraham, Isaac, and Sarah have been buried. And so it is a little shocking that he would not continue on, not exceedingly far to get to Hebron from this place. Certainly he himself will end up being buried in Hebron when he dies in Egypt. So the travel would not be any further than the travel from Egypt to there. So there is a question of why was Rachel left here at this particular point? Why was her tomb established in this non-traditional place when the family already had an established practice of being buried in Machpelah? Why would she be buried here? And that has to force us to ask a few more questions, which we are going to try to answer with the aid of our tradition. But before we do that, are there any questions, comments before we dive into our commentary? And as always, our YouTubers can jump in, and Zoomers, you don't have to unmute. You can always type in chat. But we're going to go ahead and dive into our commentary and see what it might tell us. So the first thing we have to understand of why there might be difficulty in this particular birth. After all, we haven't been introduced to this type of birth difficulties in the Torah. And while we know that birth was difficult, thanks to the reflections that came from the time of Chava, of Eve, we haven't heard birth as being described as difficult. Well, Rashi, coming from Bereshit Rabbah, Genesis Rabbah, the great Midrashic collection, gives us an insight into the word also. You'll notice that if we flip back to the description of the birth, that when the midwife says that this is also a son, this too is a son, that really that word gam is quite superfluous. It could have just said, Vayishlach ben, right? For this is a son for you. Why does the word also included there? What is its addition to the content of that sentence? Well, the Midrash says, also, meaning that word gam, means additional to you over and above Joseph. Okay, so that might be our general understanding. You've already got Joseph. That was your firstborn son for Rachel. And now you have another son. There is also a son for you. However, our rabbis explain that with each of Jacob's sons, a twin sister was born. This is the idea of the expanding of the family, sort of off screen, if you will. And though they didn't figure prominently in the story enough to receive screen time, we assume that they were being born. However, whilst with Benjamin, an additional twin sister was born, which would mean that she was actually giving birth to triplets. And that would, of course, explain why the birthing process was even more difficult this time than with the twins that were born at the time of Joseph, or that she had seen for any of the other births in the family. So this is a midrashic explanation of what was going on there. But as you can imagine, many commentaries find this unsatisfying. Not to say that it is wrong, but simply to say it doesn't quite capture why there was so much additional difficulty and what the import of this was trying to be. On the surface, the Rashi's explanation seems to be just saying that it was more difficult than usual because they were triplets. And as they didn't have ultrasound back then, this would have been news to Rachel at the time of birth, and the midwife would have then been using this information to comfort her, to say, I know it's harder than usual. That's because they're triplets, not just twins. And that would be the attempt at consolation. You have one more child in here than usual, and so of course it's going to be harder, but now there's an explanation for the difficulty. Oftentimes that will give someone encouragement of, okay, now I know what the problem is. I know how to solve it. I just need to have that third child come out, and then things will begin to heal and be better. So that would be the understanding of Rashi's explanation of why the midwife would give this information at this moment in a way to reassure Rachel. But others will often offer different explanations. So Radak, for example, says that this word also, and the idea that specifically pointing out the birth of the child to Rachel as being a boy, that this is as you had said when you gave birth to Joseph, when you, Rachel, asked God to grant you another son, all the way back in chapter 30. When Rachel has Joseph, she asks in her statement of gratitude, she also asks for more. And well, here is more. So she is having her additional son now, just like she asked. Not entirely sure why that's helpful. Well, hold on. Rashbam will help us fill that in. But what she is trying to say here, according to Radak, is that she needs to get a hold of or to strengthen herself. It's one of those words that's a little tricky to put into English, right? For chazak, that she has to redouble her efforts, that this is not something that she should be fearful of. This is something that she should recognize as a fulfillment of her request to God. And Rashbam kind of fills in why that would be especially reassuring. The midwife reassured Rachel that God did not mean to kill her, but that he had accepted her prayer. She wanted to calm Rachel's fear for her life. So Rashbam takes it that extra step beyond Radak and says, look, by reminding Rachel that she had prayed for a son, when the midwife recognizes that it is a son, probably from a breech birth, for example, where he was coming out legs first rather than head first, then that means the midwife can tell her, God has answered your prayer to have a son, and the implication, which turns out to be false, but the midwife certainly wouldn't have known it at the time, not being a prophetess. The implication is, if God fulfilled your prayer to have a son, then God would certainly not kill you in the process. Now, this is, of course, the difficulty of speaking for God. When people like to put words into God's mouth or like to ascribe different actions as being, well, God would definitely do this or God wouldn't do that, oftentimes they get into trouble unless they happen to actually be a prophet, and even some of the prophets sometimes overstep their knowledge. So this is apparently an understandable explanation by the midwife at the time as she tries to reassure Rachel. But unfortunately, it is based off the mistaken assumption that if God is giving you the child that you asked for, then God will certainly keep you safe through the birth process, because it turns out that that doesn't happen. And as we'll talk about a little bit further on, that doesn't mean that God was against Rachel. It doesn't mean that this was punishment for Rachel. It doesn't mean that this is punishment for anyone. It doesn't mean that this shows less favor for Benjamin or anyone else. This should not be used, the tragedy of this case, as an indicator of God's will. And in fact, as we've talked about many other times in other classes, those people who try to point to different events as indicators of God's will, unless their name is Moses, or they happen to be an accredited prophet, which we don't have in these days, they really should shut up, because that is not the way to speak to a person in their individual situation, and especially not in their individual pain. It is one thing to point to the established promises of God in general, the words of the prophets, the words of Moses, obviously, in Tanakh, the guidance of our tradition of what we believe the world is shaping to be. But to point to somebody and say, you're having a boy, therefore you'll get through this fine. It's a perfectly fine if it was meant simply as a reassurance to help give her strength. But if she thought she was actually interpreting God's will, then she really missed the boat on that one. And it is always dangerous to believe that you can interpret God's will in any situation, which is, of course, why we don't look for signs and portents and symbols and dreams and other things. Instead, we follow halakha, we follow the mitzvot, we follow the things that we are sure about of what we should do each and every day or for different circumstances. That is what gives us the direction to know what we should be doing, rather than relying upon our interpretation of these less reliable indicators, which may not indicate at all what we think. Really what this indicates is that life is fragile and precious, and that we should be very grateful that we have done more in the last 100 years to make sure that women, children, and all are able to survive not only childbirth, but all the difficulties of life. Would that we had begun that process centuries ago. But Chizkuni is going to come and bring us to another level. Rashi writes that the midwife referred by the word gam, also, to Joseph, right? So yes, she's referring, yes, you had another son. Remember we talked about him? She meant that Rachel's prayer at the time when she gave birth to Joseph, that she would be granted to give birth to another son, had been fulfilled. And so she encouraged Rachel with her words, suggesting that it was not God's intention to let her die at this time, which again shows that the midwife was incorrect. Skuni is making it even clearer that what the midwife did may have had good intentions, and it may have even been medically helpful, but unfortunately, it was not a correct interpretation of what God wanted, nor was it her place to proclaim what God wanted. Okay, so Or HaChaim is going to try and explain this for us a little bit more about why the midwife would behave in this way. And he's going to sort of summarize many of these ideas. So what exactly was Rachel's fear, which the midwife tried to alleviate, right? Why are you giving her the words of encouragement, it's also a boy? Assuming that Rachel was afraid to die, how did the midwife's words relieve Rachel's fear? By saying, this one too is a son for you, right? Naturally, Rachel, well, obviously worried about her child, is also worried about herself, and she is the one that is in distress. So telling her it's a boy doesn't tell her anything about whether she's going to live. Well, in order to understand this, we must refer to Bereshit Rabbah 82:8, whereas a twin sister was born with all the other sons of Jacob, Benjamin's birth was accompanied by the birth of two twin sisters. This is why the midwife told Rachel that she should not be afraid to die, but that her special difficulties were due to her giving birth to triplets, something that had not been the case when she gave birth to Joseph. The word also was a reference to the births which would accompany the birth of Benjamin. That this is an also. Therefore, for that word gam is not saying this one is also a boy, meaning Joseph. It is this one is a boy, which should remind you of your prayer for Joseph, and also above and beyond the usual twin we would have expected, there is also a second one, meaning triplets. So that is explaining why you are in this dire circumstance. Again, it explains why she is in the dire circumstance. It does not necessarily explain why she shouldn't be afraid. It could just be that the midwife here is now trying to say, perhaps more gently than Chizkuni and the others were arguing, it's not that God has fulfilled your prayer and of course he's going to keep you safe, but more to the point of saying, yes, God has fulfilled your prayer, you're having a boy, and there's an abundance, meaning this extra girl is coming as well, which is why it is so painful and so difficult, but you can take care of that too. That this is not an unprecedented, it is not an impossible situation to deal with, that the midwife's intention here may have been simply to tell her it's a natural thing, rare, but natural, and as it is natural, women are able to often survive and take care of this. Unfortunately, the midwife's prediction that she would be okay, that this was a natural enough occurrence that Rachel's body would be able to cope, proves to be false. So this is not meant to be a harsh criticism of the midwife. She was doing what she could to try and help Rachel, and she was doing what she could to try and help the baby being born. And unfortunately, whether she was misspeaking with regards to God's intentions or whether she was overly optimistic about Rachel's chances, given the more complicated birth that she was experiencing, in both situations, it turns out that Rachel does pass. But we have one more text on the notion of this difficulty of birth that I want to discuss, and that is taken from Nida, that perhaps there was an even more fundamental reason of why the birth was difficult. What is different about the labor pains experienced by a woman who gives birth to a female? That they are greater than those experienced by a woman who gives birth to a male. So the Talmud believes that this is a normal procedure. This is part of the folk wisdom, if you will, that has made its way into the Talmud. It is not necessarily meant to be divinely inspired, but instead reflects the average understanding of the world around them for the people in the ancient world, or in this case, classical world, that people just sort of knew this is what it was like. The same way that somebody nowadays might say it's easier to raise a girl than it is to raise a boy, with no foundation in any research or even necessarily personal experience if they would stop to reflect upon it. Likewise, the rabbis will sometimes channel things that are part of the folk wisdom of their era, but not necessarily scientifically established in our day, and maybe not even established anecdotally if you were to just ask around in their day, but it was still passed around as a general understanding. And sometimes it is just nice to remember that the rabbis too were the product of their age. So why is it harder to give birth to a girl than a boy? The Gemara answers, This one, a male fetus, emerges in the manner in which it engages in intercourse. Just as a male engages in intercourse facing downward, so too it is born while facing down. And that, meaning the female fetus, emerges in the manner in which it engages in intercourse, that is to say, facing upwards. And yes, we're talking about the missionary positions here. Consequently, that one, a female fetus, turns its face around before it's born, but this one, a male fetus, does not turn its face around before it is born. Now, this is not true. There is no research I have been able to come across that says that girls are born in a different orientation than boys with any kind of predictability or regularity. But for the rabbis and the people of their generation, this explained why it hurt more, because the girls had to make an additional 180 rotation in addition to moving from the normal posture of in utero into the birthing posture with the head down, that there was an additional 180 twist, and that additional twist was what caused additional labor pain. Again, there's no evidence that this is true now, and there's no evidence that this was true at the time. But it does go to show that rather than simply say the midwife misspoke, so too medically here, the rabbis are also perhaps making an error. And this is the kind of thing that might have been said to a woman. Oh, yes, I know it's hard. You must be having a girl as a way to help her cope with the pain, to help her feel, okay, that's why it's hard. And that's normal. I can do it. I can deal with it. The same way that the midwife was saying, you must be having triplets. That's why it's hard. You can deal with it. And it's meant as encouragement by giving you a veneer of understanding. And certainly that quest for certainty, to quote Dewey, gives a reassurance for people in the midst of crisis. And often that reassurance is enough to help them get through it. Unfortunately, there's no guarantee, as we see, that this will be what makes the difference. And Rachel passed, and so too have many other countless women passed in childbirth, despite the best of reassurances, which is, of course, why reassurances are nice, but it is even better to actually give medical aid, and why we should continue to fight for maternal survival techniques and treatments, as well as taking care of the infant. Okay, and on that last note of the infant, just as a reminder of the sensitivity that Judaism tries to bring to these issues, that these are not just ephemeral concepts that deal with ancient people and our patriarchs and matriarchs. Just a short excerpt from a more modern book on the question of marriage and fertility. When talking about pain, he teaches, what is the pain that has no limit? That is the pain of one who has a stillbirth. For the pain of pregnancy, the pain of birth, and the pain of work on the land have a beginning and an end. So he's trying to create sensitivity in the rest of us, not the person who has had the tragedy of a stillbirth, that when somebody has gone through the pain of birth, that there is an end to that, and that end is the child. That there is a not exactly compensation, but that there is a new joy that comes that does help to alleviate at least the memory of the pain, and certainly to refocus life in a way that allows the pain to begin to fade in our focus. When the tragedy of a stillbirth takes place, then that doesn't occur. The pain of the pregnancy and the pain of the birth comes to naught, for the child is dead upon birth. And the grieving that happens at that point is not going to be tempered by the life of a new child. And thus it becomes a much more difficult burden to bear, and something that demands a much more support and help. As much as people will rally around somebody who has given birth to a child, bringing gifts and all of the other wonderful things that a community will do, sometimes we don't do enough for somebody who has gone through the more painful side of not having the child at the end, of having a stillbirth. But that too needs a great deal of help from the community. Something to remind ourselves, even as we fight to make sure that every mother and child has a good life, and the tragedies like this become rarer and rarer. But when they occur, they desperately need our help. Okay, but we're not done yet, because we have to still answer the other question of why here? Why was Rachel buried there? It seems so strange that he would not take her to Hebron and bury her in the cave with his ancestors, when that was his own thought for himself. And so we turn back again to Bereshit Rabbah, and we look at the Midrash there. What did Yaakov see that he buried Rachel in the way to Ephrat? He had a prophetic vision that the exiles, meaning the Israelites leaving the land of Israel during the destruction by the Babylonians, would in the future pass through there. Therefore, he buried there, so she would ask for mercy for them. So the idea is that with her grave there, it will be that as they passed by her grave, her spirit will be interceding on their behalf. What does that mean? Well, we're going to get the glimpse here and then an expanded version. A voice in Ramah, a lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. Thus says Adonai, refrain your voice from weeping, for there is hope for your future. Now, this is an excerpt taken from the book of Jeremiah, which I'll read the larger passage here. Thus says Adonai, a voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are not. Thus says Adonai, refrain your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for your work shall be rewarded, says Adonai. They shall come back from the land of the enemy. But there is hope, and there is hope for your future, says Adonai, and your children shall return to their own borders. So Jeremiah, as harsh of a critic as he was of the people of his generation, also carried this great prophecy that there would be a return. And indeed, we know that under the Persian Empire, we were allowed to return and rebuild within our own country. So the idea is that Rachel is weeping for her children, meaning all of the Jewish people, and that in that process, she is helping to give us comfort that her cries will be heard and that we will thus be allowed to return. Now, what is it about Rachel in particular that would make her the advocate for our people? Why Rachel? Why not Avraham? I mean, was Sarah not crying for her children when they were carried off to captivity in Babylon? Was Rivka not crying? And after all, Rachel is only the mother of 2 of the tribes. She's not even the mother of all of us. So if we're really going to get nitpicky, she seems like a very strange advocate to have on our behalf, which is, of course, why there is an expanded midrash explaining why she makes the perfect advocate for our people. I'm just going to adjust that because the edge was getting cut off. At that moment, meaning at the moment when we were being carried off as slaves and captives to Babylon, the matriarch Rachel leaped before God and said, Master of the universe, it is known before you that Yaakov, your servant, loved me very greatly and worked for my father for 7 years in order to marry me. And when those 7 years were complete and the time came for my wedding to my husband, my father decided to replace me with my sister for my husband, the story that we saw from earlier in the Torah. This was exceedingly hard for me, as you can imagine, for it was known to me. The Midrash says that Rachel knew that this was her father's plan. And I told my husband of it and gave him a sign by which he would be able to distinguish me from my sister, so that my father would not be able to exchange me. Again, this is in an earlier Midrash, the idea being that Rachel knew of the plot and she gave secret codes that to Yaakov so that he could check who it was, and that way the deception wouldn't be successful. Thereafter, I regretted it and stifled my desire, and I had mercy on my sister that she would not be shamed. However, after giving her husband, her would-be husband, those signs, she then realizes, my sister is going to be humiliated because she's going to show up doing what our father's telling her, and she's going to be dressed like the bride, and she's going to not know the code words, and she will be exposed in front of the entire community, and the deceit will be there. And even though my husband, would-be husband, will be spared, my sister is going to be destroyed. So in the evening, they exchanged my sister for me, and I gave my sister all the signs that I had given to my husband in order that he would believe that she was Rachel. In the end, she helps her sister, giving her the code words. Not only that, I climbed under the bed upon which he lay with my sister. Think of the indignity of that, of what she is sacrificing on behalf of her sister. He spoke with her, and she remained silent. I answered him each and every time, so that he would not recognize my sister by her voice. I performed kindness for her and was not jealous of her, and I did not allow her to be shamed. All right, so I've done other teachings in the past about the relationship between Rachel and Leah, and in particular this episode in Midrash, so I don't want to go over too much, but understand that Rachel is framing her own experience as somebody who put aside her own jealousy, who put aside her own rivalry, who put aside her own desire in order to spare her sister shame and humiliation. And that was an incredible act on her part. That is where she is coming from. And that is something that is uniquely her trait, her action. That Leah didn't do what Rachel did. Leah wasn't in that same position because she was the one being foisted upon Yaakov rather than the one who had to set herself aside. Nor did any of the other patriarchs or matriarchs in the prior generations have such a situation. Therefore, she is in a unique position to say what she is about to say. And it takes some chutzpah to say it. Get that centered on the screen so we can finish it off in one go. And if I, a mere mortal, dust and ashes, was not jealous of my rival and did not allow her to be shamed and humiliated, what of you, living, eternal, merciful King? Why are you jealous of idolatry, which has no substance to it? Right, so Rachel is making the point to God, look, I was able to overcome my jealousy, even though I'm just a human, right? We are known for being jealous and petty and mean and nasty, and yet I was able to overcome it on behalf of my sister. So, God, how about you set your jealousy aside? You are jealous of the idols of the Israelites. That was one of the chief sins at the time of Jeremiah. And you are jealous of sticks, of rocks, of gold. I mean, how can you? I put aside jealousy of a real flesh and blood rival, somebody who literally displaced me. And you are jealous of something which cannot come close to touching you, something which isn't even real in the way that people treat it as real, something which is nothing. So you have exiled my children, and they have been killed by the sword, and their enemies have done with them as they please. How could you let your jealousy of something with no substance allow such a horrible thing happen to my children? When I set aside my jealousy so that there could be children, so that there would be a Jewish people in the first place. Immediately God's mercy was aroused, and he said, for you, Rachel, I shall return Israel to their place. This is as it is written. So God says, back to Jeremiah, a voice is heard in Ramah. It is the sound of bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping over her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children, for they are gone. And it is written, so says God, withhold your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for there is a reward for your act. And it is written, there is hope for your end, promises God, and the children will return to their borders. So this particular expanded form of this midrash and in this dialogue is found here in Eicha Rabbah, which is the midrash on the book of Lamentations, the book of Eicha, which is commemorating the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians in 586. So our ancestors have looked to this as an insight into the promise of eventual return, the promise of that forgiveness, if you will, that Rachel had earned on our behalf. And it is not just saying that, God is willing to do this wonderful thing of returning us. It is saying, even if we don't think we're worthy, for Rachel, we would be worthy. Meaning that for Rachel has made an argument before God such that God cannot but return us to our land. Because while we may have warranted the punishment of exile during this Babylonian period, That does not mean that it should be eternal, and it does not mean that it is irrevocable. Because if Rachel was able to do what she did, that act of hers, then God owes it to her, even if not to us because we haven't earned it ourselves, but he owes it to her to allow her children to have this additional chance, this additional time. And so we can rest assured that God will eventually make good on that. And that helped to strengthen the people of Israel when they were in Babylon, knowing that eventually they would be allowed to return. It didn't look like that at the time. Certainly the other people that had been taken from the north by the earlier empires had not returned, and unfortunately still have not returned. But this allowed this generation to have that strength. Now, again, this is being done with a different insight than the voice of the midwife. Certainly, there is more prophetic understanding here than what the midwife had. But we do understand here that it is of the same purpose. Just as Rachel was going through the hardship of birth and the midwife was trying to comfort her, so too we have gone through many hardships and different generations, not just the generation of the exile here, but throughout the last 1,000 years. And even over the last year, things have become exceedingly bitter in many different parts of the world for the Jewish people. And so we have to remind ourselves to also take strength, to resolve ourselves that indeed we will eventually come through this. And that we will find that it is not only Rachel that has done incredible acts which would earn such kindness from God for us, but that we ourselves are also capable of that. When we act with more kindness, when we set aside our jealousy, our rivalry, our bitterness, when we act with love rather than hate, we are acting in a way that is reminiscent of Rachel and indeed of all of the others of our ancestors that are worthy to be emulated. And we become more worthy of redemption, and we help make sure that the generations that come after will, God willing, have an easier time and not experience the same birth pangs of this redemption. We'll finish there. And again, if anybody has any questions or comments, you're welcome to either type them, chat them, or unmute if you're on Zoom. But otherwise, I will see you at our next study session. Just give it a couple seconds to give people that chance. All right. Take care, everyone, and be well.